We're going to be in Romans 9 again this morning, Romans 9. And this morning we're going to be walking through verses 6 through 13 of the 9th chapter of Romans. My 4 children, they love to boss me around and tell me what to do. They love to say, "Dad, you need to go and take me out for lunch so I can have a Happy Meal." Or, "Dad, you need to tell Isaac that he needs to give me the Nintendo." Or, "Dad, you need to go out and buy me a new hermit crab." Or, "Dad, you need to take me to F3 in the morning so that I can play with your friends." Dad, do this. Dad, do that. One would think that with how often my kids are bossing me around, that I was one to obey their commands. I'm not. I don't. At times my kids tell me what to do and I don't even respond. But occasionally, once in a blue moon, or maybe even a little more often than that, my kids demand of me, they command me, and I say yes. I say yes not because I'm giving in out of frustration, or not because I just want to silence their voices, but I say yes because they are taking my own promises and my own words and they are throwing them back at me. Just last Sunday, I told the kids that we would go out for snowballs that evening if they were well behaved throughout the afternoon. And I had forgot about that earlier promise, and at dinner, one of my kids brought up how I needed to take them out for snowballs that evening. And my initial thought was, I don't need to do anything this evening. If I don't want to take you out for snowballs, I'm not going out. And then Jen, along with all 4 of the kids, reminded me that I promised to take them out for snowballs if they had obeyed. And since I promised snowballs, there will be snowballs. Not only will there be snowballs, but they will be stuffed with ice cream because I am a gracious dad who gives above and beyond what I promised at times. This morning in Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 13, we're going to see that God is not obligated to do anything for anyone. You cannot put God in your debt. It doesn't matter what your last name is. It doesn't matter how well you behave. God owes you nothing. There's only one way to be a child of God, only one way to be His chosen, and that is through God's own promises. I said last week we are looking at what might be the great objection to the gospel. And that is if the Jews rejected Jesus as their Messiah, how can we rightly claim that Jesus is the Son of God and the Son of David? And Paul's point this morning is going to be, God is not obligated to save every physical descendant of Abraham or Israel. Israel's failure to believe is not a failure on God's part because no one can come to God and say, "God, look at my last name," or "God, look at all the wonderful things that I have done. You must save me." That's not how it works. It's not our works that saves. It's not election that saves. Election is to service. Election is to bring the promises of God to the families of the world, but it is the promise of God that saves. Let's look now at the first phrase of Romans 9:6 to introduce our topic this morning. Romans 9:6 says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed." This verse is crucial to understanding all of Romans chapters 9 through 11 because it is telling us what Paul is writing about. Paul is not primarily talking about election or salvation for us today in the church, but he is talking about, has the word of God to Israel failed? Have the promises that God spoke to His chosen people failed? Does Israel's unbelief equate to failure on the part of God. And we need to remember that while what we're going to see is there will clearly be some application for us today in the church, these chapters are primarily about Israel as a nation. From the beginning to the end of these chapters, God is talking about his word to the physical nation of Israel. And the point that Paul is going to make is rather simple. God's word has not failed because God is not obligated to save anyone. Just because someone is a physical descendant of Abraham, God is not forced to save them. Just because someone has done a lot of good works according to the law, God has not been put into a position where he must save them. God is free to save whomever he desires. God is free to judge whoever he desires to based upon his plans. These chapters are about God's freedom to save Israel according to his plans and promises and not the demands of Israel. And this has a very important lesson for us today. We need to understand that we cannot, through our good name or our good works, put God in a position where he is obligated to do what we would desire him to do. No matter how much money you put in the offering box in the back of the church, you could donate enough money for us to build an entire new church building, and you give so much that we put your name right on the front of the church. And all of those donations are not enough to force God's hand to answer your prayers as you desire. You see, God's word has not failed because God refuses to follow your wishes and your desires. We have an entire movement in the church today that is called the Word of Faith movement. This movement teaches that people can access God's power by speaking the right words, praying the right prayers, or giving the right donation. But Romans 9 through 11 comes to that movement, to that mindset, and says, I don't care if you are a descendant of Israel himself. I don't care if you have followed all 613 laws of Moses with the deepest of faithfulness. You cannot come before God and say, God, deliver me, give to me on my terms. And if you don't, God, that means that you are a failure. Because that's not how God works. Just because the Jews rejected their Messiah, turned their backs on him, didn't come in the manner that they expected Jesus to come, it does not mean that God's word failed his people. God is free to bless according to his plans and his purposes. And what Paul shows us is that God chooses, God elects to deliver his people Israel and also us in the church today through his promises and not according to our flesh. Look at verses 6 through 9. For they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel, nor are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants. But through Isaac your descendants will be named. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. We must understand who Paul is talking to for these verses to really make sense for us today. He is talking to the Jew, or maybe even the Gentile, who believes that all Israel, every single ethnic Jew, must receive the benefits of their Messiah, or that means God has failed his people. And since they could look around the world of their day, and we can look around the world of our day and see that every Jew has not believed in Jesus Christ, the vast majority of Jews have not believed in Christ. They're saying, Paul, this must mean that your Christ, your Messiah, is a failure for not saving his own people. But Paul comes to say, oh, hold on a minute. That's never been how God has worked, even when it comes to his own people. Because not everyone who is in Israel in the flesh is the Israel whom God has saved or chosen. We know this from the very beginning because all of Abraham's kids were not the elect. It was only those who were elect according to or following the promises God has given to his people. You see, Abraham had multiple children. Isaac, the son of the promise, wasn't Abraham's firstborn. He wasn't even Abraham's lastborn. Because according to Genesis chapter 25, we often forget about this verse, but after Abraham had Ishmael and then Isaac, Abraham had 6 more kids. Genesis 25, 1 and 2 says, "Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore to him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua." So in Abraham's own household, the promise was only effective to 1 out of 7 kids. And to illustrate that this is talking about national promises and not the spiritual promise of individual salvation, I want to point out that Genesis, I believe, presents Ishmael, Abraham's oldest son, as saved, even though he wasn't the chosen son. We see Ishmael as a man who I believe was somebody of faith in 2 passages. One, Ishmael was present alongside Isaac for the very significant burial of Abraham in Genesis. And then when Ishmael died, we read these words describing Ishmael's death. Genesis 25:17. "These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people." The phrase "was gathered to his people" is a very important phrase in Genesis, and it's used of someone who died in the faith and they were gathered to Abraham to wait with Abraham for the final resurrection due to the Messiah. So unless you also want to believe that God only chose to save Isaac out of all of Abraham's 7 children for eternal life, and then damned the rest to judgment, we should see Romans 9 as speaking to national promises made to the nation of Israel. Paul's point here in contrasting Isaac and the other sons is to say that God isn't forced to using Ishmael to bring about his promises or Ishbak to bring about his promises simply because their father is Abraham. But God is free to work with whomever he chooses. And whom does God work with? Whom does God bring into his blessing? But it is the child of promise. It is through the word of promise. Both of the Old Testament quotations in this passage we just read come from Genesis. Romans 9:7 quotes from Genesis 21:12. And Romans 9:9 quotes from Genesis 18:10. And they speak on how God chose to bless Isaac. Not simply because Isaac is a physical descendant of Abraham, but because Isaac is the promised son of Abraham. So this tells us that in Israel 3,500 years ago, and even up to the church today, the key when it comes to our relationship with God is not who is your father or who is your mother. The key has nothing to do with your lineage or your heritage or your family tree. It is about where do you stand in relation to the promises of God. The children of the promise are considered to be descendants and not the children of the flesh. So God is going to save his people Israel, but it will only be the Israelites who are included in the promises of God. And that is not every single descendant of Abraham, because they did not all believe in the promises. And so we should need to ask ourselves now, how do I relate to the promises of God? And how do I respond to the promises of God in order to be a part of them? And I say, if you want to be part of the promises of God, you discover it, you become part of them in the same way that Abraham became part of them before Isaac was ever born. Genesis 15, 5 and 6 says, "And he, that is God, took him, that is Abraham, outside and said, 'Now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them.' And God said to Abraham, 'So shall your descendants be.' And Abraham believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it, he considered it to him as righteousness." Abraham believed in God and in his promises, and as a result of believing in the promise of God, Abraham was then counted as right or just before God and was then included in those promises. Even for Abraham, he was not picked based upon his flesh, but Abraham was picked based upon his faith in the promises of God. The point in bringing up Ishmael and Isaac is to say that salvation is not arbitrary. We are not saved because God looks down at someone and says, "Oh, you have the right bloodline, therefore you get to be saved." The point is to say God has made specific and clear promises to bring about his salvation. Those promises were first given to Abraham. The promises were then narrowed down to come through Isaac and his descendants. And if we believe in those promises, we will find God's grace and the success of his word. So even in Abraham and Isaac's own generation, if Ishmael, who was not the chosen and promised son, if Ishmael wanted to be saved, it had nothing to do with his physical heritage or who his dad was, but for Ishmael, it was all about, do you believe in the promise that God made to your father Abraham and that it would come through your half-brother Isaac? Now, I believe that Ishmael's participation in Abraham's burial and Moses' testimony of Ishmael's life after death shows us that Ishmael believed in just that the promised seed would come through Isaac. And heaven forbid that there is any person in this room or any person who will ever listen to this sermon online that you would ever stand before the judgment of God at the end of days and think that you could stand before God and say, "Lord, you are obligated to save me because I am Jewish, or because of who my father was, or because I was a physical member of Grace Community Bible Church." God is not obligated to save anyone because of who we are related to and who we are in relation to. And for some of us, that's not always an easy concept to grasp because we all live lives where who we're related to, it matters. It has consequences. For me, when I was a child growing up, the most anticipated day I had each year was not Christmas. It was not Christmas Eve. It was the day before Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve. It was a very highly anticipated day in the Wilson household for my brother and myself because every year my father's company, Universal Instruments, they would rent out the local Chuck E. Cheese so that all of the employees and their kids could go there and eat all-you-could-eat pizza, and they would set up the arcades so that you could play the games again and again and never have to put a quarter in the arcade. And all I needed to do to enjoy the benefit of going to that Chuck E. Cheese party each year was to be a descendant of David Wilson. Being a son of my dad was all that was required. And we're all used to receiving perks based upon our family. It could be something small like a free vacation with the grandparents, or it could be an entire career being a part of the family business, or an inheritance from the will of a loved one. But Romans 9 through 11 says that's not how it works with God. God didn't tie his blessings to physical heritage. His hands will not be forced to automatically include some or automatically exclude others. But God's grace has always been tied to the children of the promise. And that is, where do you stand on the promises of God? Are you trusting in his promises for life? Or are you leaning upon something else? And Paul doubles down on the importance of God's promises in verses 10 through 13. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his choice, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Paul used Isaac and Ishmael to illustrate the importance of God's election through promise. And now he uses Jacob and Esau as well. The purpose of Isaac and Ishmael was to show us that before God, any physical heritage, even having Abraham yourself as your father, doesn't matter. What matters is, where are you in the promises of God? Now he uses Jacob and Esau to show us that it's not based on the works that we do. Verse 11 emphasizes this point by saying, they had not done anything good or bad, not because of works, but because of him who calls. So God's selection of Jacob was not based upon Jacob's moral superiority in comparison to Esau. And if we're honest, looking at the lives of Jacob and Esau, I don't think you could make a very good argument that Jacob was more moral than his brother Esau. Jacob deceived his older brother. Jacob deceived his father. Jacob deceived his uncle. Jacob had 2 wives, which that in of itself is going to give you some problems, but especially when you prefer one wife in comparison to another wife, that's going to create a lot of stress and division in your family. So what we see is that Jacob's place in God's family did not come by works that Jacob had done. So Paul's saying that is the point here. It is about God's choice in his purposes. And the choice of God was to pass on the Abrahamic blessing through Israel and his descendants in the nation of Israel, and not through Esau and his descendants in the nation of Edom. The use of verses 12 and 13 of Romans 9 inform us that Paul is not thinking individually, but Paul is thinking nationally. Paul is thinking about the entire nation of Israel and the entire nation of Edom. The reason I say that is that first in verse 12, when it tells us that the older will serve the younger, there was never a point in Jacob and Esau's life where Esau ever served Jacob. Not even close. When did the servitude happen? It happened later on in their history when the nation of Edom was put in servitude to the nation of Israel. And there were several battles during the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah where Edom was fighting for their freedom and not serving Israel any longer in their national history. Second, we have the verse, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And that verse is not about God looking down at Jacob and Esau and going, oh, look at that Jacob. He's adorable. I'm going to choose to love him and be affectionate to him. But oh, that Esau. Woo. I can't stand people with red hair. And I'm going to hate him for all of his life. That is not what that verse is saying to us. But Romans 9:13 is actually a quotation from Malachi chapter 1. And it's very clear in Malachi 1 that God is not talking about the individual Jacob and the individual Esau, but he's talking about the nation of Israel and the nation of Edom. In that context, God is saying, I am choosing to send my blessing through Israel and not choosing to send my blessing through Edom. We need to understand that this contrast of love and hate was much different in the ancient world than the way we would speak about it today. Love did not mean romantic love. Hatred did not mean bitter revulsion, but it means to select one person over another. We read that Jacob actually hated Leah, but he loved Rachel. It didn't mean that Jacob despised his wife Leah, but it means that he set more affection upon Rachel than he did his other wife. And also, even more picturesque, Jesus himself tells us in Luke 14:26 that if you want to be his disciple, that means you need to hate your father and mother, your wife and kids, in order to be God's disciple. So sorry, kids and Jen, apparently I need to hate you, according to Luke 14:26. But that is not what Jesus was saying, but Jesus was saying, you need to prefer me above your earthly family if you want to be my disciple. It's just a picturesque way for Jesus to say, you need to make me the top priority in your life. So God here in these verses is choosing to send his promise, the Christ, through Jacob's line and not through Esau's line. So this is not about who is and is not saved, but it's about God saying, I have the freedom to establish my own plan through which my promises will be delivered, and I'm going to tell you how to access these promises. It's not up to what you do, but it is up to what the Lord declares. Just think about for a moment what Paul would be saying if he intended to communicate God loved Jacob, so he elected Jacob for salvation, but hated Esau, so at the minimum was keeping Esau out of the promises. I would argue first that if we are taking election of love to salvation, we must also be taking election of hate, meaning to condemnation. So this would be God purposefully choosing before Abraham's grandson was born to send him to hell before birth. Second, the context of verses 12 and 13, as I said, are both national. So Paul would also be saying here, and primarily be saying, everyone who is descendant of Jacob would automatically be chosen by God to receive his love and to have salvation. And also everyone who's a descendant of Esau will automatically be chosen to be condemned by God and to receive the judgment. But we just talked about with Isaac and Ishmael that the point of that passage is saying it's not about physical descendant. It's not about who your father is, but it's about your place in the promise of God. So this goes contrary to the point that Paul just made, that God's word is based upon his promise and not upon our physical heritage. So in these verses, Paul is not saying God is making a choice to save one person and eternally condemn another person. So all that matters is, did God choose you? And if God chose you like Jacob, great. And if God didn't choose you like Esau, well, there's nothing you can do about it because God didn't choose you. God is not beholden to select Esau over Jacob or Jacob over Esau, because one is superior in morality to another. That is what these verses are saying. God does not have to pick Esau because he was the better son or the better hunter or the more honest man. Esau cannot come before God and say, choose me because I treated dad better than Jacob did. It's not based on works, but it is based on the promises and plans of God. So we cannot live in such a way where we can say, God, this is why you have to save me, and God, this is how you have to save me. Something really exciting has started to happen for me in regards to my book reviews that I've been doing online. Now, this might not be very exciting in your eyes, but in my eyes, Ooh, I got all the tingles because of this. But right now, I realized a couple of months ago at the beginning of the summer that if I contact a publisher and send them a link to my book reviews and ask them for a free book, the response will be, they will send me all of these books for free just because I asked them to. And I am just over the moon that I can get all of these free books, which is great for my bank account, but absolutely terrible for my humility. Because as soon as I got a couple of free books sent to me that I downloaded on my Kindle, all of a sudden the inner monologue of Sean Wilson started to say, oh, there's some of these books that I'm reviewing. If I don't review them, they will never get a review online. So you know what that means? Those publishers better send me a free book because I'm the only one who's going to review it. And all of a sudden I started to feel like they are obligated to send me books because of what I am going to do. And I think all of the human race has a common and at times fatal flaw in view of how we view everyone in our lives, including God. And we view others and God in a way where we say, because of how I helped you, because of how I did good things, because of how I made this donation, you are now obligated to do for me. God, because I've been at church each Sunday, God, because I've put money in that offering box, God, because I got this sin out of my life, God, you are obligated to save me. Or maybe yours is, Lord, because of all the ways that I have suffered in my life, you owe me salvation. You owe me your love. You owe me your help because of who I am and what I have done. And a common refrain throughout history is, God owes Israel because Israel was set apart as his chosen people. Romans 9, 6 through 13 is meant to say, slow down on that line of thinking. God doesn't owe you anything. God is not obligated to save anyone because their last name is Kohen or because they have meticulously followed the law. It is not our history. It is not our works. But God is free to save whoever he wants. And those that God saves are those who come to him according to his promises and his purposes. So if you want to find the grace, the mercy, the love, and the compassion of God, it is there, it is free, and it is available. But you must come through the grace of Jesus Christ. And this is why we celebrate the Lord's Supper, because this is where we find the promises of God, that to all those who believe that his body was broken for you, to all those who believe that his blood was shed for you, believe in Jesus, believe in his works, and then he will cleanse you from your sins and restore you and place you in his family. He gave you his life so you may have life forevermore.